Okay, our speaker is Valerie Marvin. She is employed by the state as a curator and a historian curator of the Capitol building.
Cool.
She was here several years ago, pre-COVID, and gave us a history of the Capitol building. It was very interesting. She was a speaker last year at the Tri-River Luncheon, and we liked the program, and we asked if she could come and do it for us, and she's here. So,
Yay!
and she's also involved in Lansing Historical Society.
Yes.
Glenn.
All right, thank you, Valerie.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come visit again. So tonight I'm going to be talking about Capitol women, and I always like to start this presentation off with a question. So the building that you see on the screen is our current Capitol, the third that Michigan has had. Of course, our first Capitol building was in downtown Detroit. Then in 1847 we relocated to Lansing, used a temporary wooden building for 30 years. And then in 1878 we completed the building you see on your screen. And that building has served as our seat of state government ever since. So we're now 144 years and going. With that in mind, when this building opened up in 1879, how many women do you think worked in it?
3.
None is the answer I hear the most. Truth is, there were about 200 people who went to work in this building every day. Now, most of them worked for the different departments. The building, of course, was the only state office building in downtown Lansing. Good luck wrapping your mind around that. I've been trying for over a decade. And it was designed for the legislature, who were part-time, so they were not there most days. It had offices for the governor. It had a room for the Supreme Court chamber. It had the old state library. But it was the departments who made up the bulk of the foot traffic day in and day out. And according to state records, because back in those days government was so small, the Auditor General and his staff kept records of the names and salaries of every single state employee, all 200 of them. We know that of those 200 people, between 3 and 4 dozen of them were women. Which does not fit with what we think of when we think of the 19th century. The 19th century is famous for being the century of separate spheres, where men started to leave to go to work every day, be that in a factory, be that in an office, be that in another place of business. And the 19th century was when women continued to stay home and really became identified with the domestic sphere more than ever before. When we think of these separate spheres, though, we forget that there were plenty of women in the 19th century, particularly during the American Civil War and in the years afterward, women who had lost their spouses or their fathers or their brothers, their male breadwinners, who had to go to work. We often tell the story of Rosie the Riveter, these women who during World War II needed to go out and earn a paycheck to support their family. That same thing happened in the 1860s as well. And a conversation starts to emerge about, is it proper for women to work? Can women be good employees in a male-dominated situation like a Capitol building? Now, Michigan, if you go back through time, you can always see the influence of women in government. In fact, our first state governor, Stevens T. Mason, was very, very close with his sister Emily. And his sister Emily was often at his side, helping him make decisions, helping him write speeches, serving as his hostess at events. And there is a long tradition of female family members doing that kind of work. But this was uncompensated. However, that changes. In 1869, a completely audacious woman named Harriet Tenney, who had been quietly, for no pay, working alongside her husband in the state library, her husband J.E. Tenney, she did something radical. She asked the governor for the position herself. See, word had started to circulate that her husband was not going to be reappointed. So she had the gumption, as my grandmother would have said, in 1869 to pick up 2 pieces of state library letterhead and write a letter to the governor. Now she opens it demurely. She realizes she is a woman who is asking for something extraordinary. So she opens the letter by asking if she should consider applying for the position of state librarian. She then spends the next 2 pages doing exactly that. She lists all of her qualifications. She talks about the fact that she has been working in the library already for 10 years. She knows the physical requirements of the job and can do them because she has been. She talks about specific people in government, both city and state levels, who endorse her for this position. And she closes by noting that in Minnesota, there is already a woman serving as state librarian. Code, women can do this work. And within about 10 days, Governor H.P. Baldwin shocks many people by appointing her. Now, Harriet understood her significance. In fact, in her first report, you can see the cover of it right here. In her first report, she recounts what a big deal this was. She goes through and talks about how many books she's acquired and how many bookshelves she's had to have built and all of the business. But then in the second to last paragraph, she says, on the 31st day of March, 1869, this library was placed in the charge of a woman. Capital W, capital O, capital M, capital A, capital N. And you have to remember, this report not only was going to be read by the people she was working with in Lansing, it was going to be read by people across the country, across the English-speaking world. Because part of what state librarians did is they exchanged documents with other governments. And we, in this era, are not only exchanging governments with other states, we are also exchanging governments with other English-speaking governments. Because most of the English-speaking world comes out of the same legal tradition, comes out of British common law. So we're getting documents from Canada. In some periods, we're getting documents from England and from Australia. So her words take flight. And we can see where people are reporting on the fact that there is a woman now in a government office as far away as Scotland. This was big news. Harriet would ultimately hold that position for 22 years. Her terms were 2 years in length, which was standard at the time. Nobody got a 4-year term in Michigan government until 1963, when we adopted our current state constitution, which means she was appointed by 7 different governors from 2 political parties. You want to talk about something that's hard to do. She survived changes when partisan power switched. And she didn't just work in the library, although certainly that would have been plenty. She also worked in her community. She was a founding member of the Lansing Women's Club, a club organized to give women an opportunity to study and learn together. She was a member of the Lansing Women's Relief Corps. She had been the president of the Ladies' Aid Society in Lansing during the Civil War. She was a member of the Lansing Temperance Union when that formed in 1874. She was involved in work at her church. She taught Sunday school. She was part of the local volunteer library that forms in Lansing in the 1870s. And she is doing this all in part because she is a public figure. And she had some pretty exciting moments. Now, probably one of the more heinous things she had to do was she had to move the entire library collection twice. Once from the second Capitol, that's the small building you see on the right-hand side in the bottom, into a temporary office block in downtown Lansing. Then, because they were afraid the floors on the second floor of that wooden Capitol were going to cave in under the library. Talk about a bad day. They came in one morning and found that they had shifted underneath. So they very quickly boxed everything up and took it somewhere else. Then, in 1878, she had to move it from that temporary building to the third state capitol. But I have to imagine when she put the last books on the shelf there, she was one happy woman, because she now had almost an entire wing of the building for her library. The entire west wing on the second, third, and fourth floors was one big open space with 5 levels of bookcases designed to house over 100,000 volumes. She talked about the space and said, for those who want to learn, this will become the Mecca of Michigan. She was so proud of her library. And that library gave her a voice. It made women, for the first time, visible not only within the walls of the state capitol, but visible in a powerful position. And ultimately, after we see her being appointed, we start to see women being hired in to other departments. Now, not all of them had such glamorous jobs. Being state librarian was about as good as it got. That was the historical equivalent of a department director. Other women did much more modest work. Some of them were hired as salary employees, some of them did piecework, and some of them did, to be honest, rather disgusting things. Mary and Catherine Coops worked as laborers or janitresses. Remember, this is the Victorian era, so we feminize everything. Harriet was a librarianess, according to some. So we also have janitresses. And we can find the Coops family in the records. They are being hired for different janitorial services, including washing pieces. What's a piece? It's a hand towel in a restroom. We don't have disposable paper towels yet. We put actual linens in the restroom, which means someone has to then take them home and wash them. And washing was something that was typically, traditionally, a woman's job. So we can see, for example, that Katie Coops is paid $2.25 for washing 45 pieces. When I think about all the things these women did, though, from washing hand towels to washing windows to cleaning floors and dusting, I think the most disgusting job had to be emptying the spittoons. When the building opened, and here we can see an early photograph taken probably in January of 1879, if you look just in this one photo, you can see at least 4 different spittoons or cuspidors. Inventories tell us there were over 300 of them in the entire building. And you gotta remember, this is in an era before plastic gloves. This is also in an era when we are just starting to really think about germs and how diseases spread. This is also in an era when tuberculosis is rife. So when you think about it, not only is that disgusting work, it's also potentially dangerous work. And it's a reminder that even in the center of state power, very basic, unpleasant tasks have to get done. Someone has to do that work. Now, a lot of women working in the building were sort of somewhere in between, if you will. Many of the women hired in worked as clerks. Now, clerk is kind of a catch-all term for office employee or staff person in the 19th century. Most clerks worked for departments. Some departments had an almost completely female staff by the early 20th century. Other departments held off seemingly as long as they could before they started hiring women. It all depended. Many women, though, started to be hired in part because often women had the opportunity to continue school longer than men did. This sounds odd to us, but many young boys were required by their families to leave school early. I had a grandfather whose education formally ended with 8th grade because it was the Great Depression. His family needed him to earn money. My grandmother was permitted to go to high school. Now, she had to board with someone and work in order to do that. But for girls, there was an advantage in that in high school, you could learn bookkeeping, you could learn typing, you could learn basic office skills that would make you marketable. And we see a lot of young women coming to Lansing from surrounding communities to take these office jobs. And good for the state, they were paid the same as their male counterparts. Now, we do not always see them rising to the top level senior positions, but we do see senior female clerks in some offices. One of them was Belle Maniatis, who was born in Michigan. Her father was a Greek immigrant. She would make jokes in some of her writings, sometimes about her Olympian last name. She grew up in mid-Michigan, and her father died when she was young. So she was able to attend high school, but she knew after school she would need to find a job and start to support the family. She is able to do this initially in Detroit and then in Lansing, clerking. She starts off working in a pension office, helping Civil War veterans. Then she moves to the Adjutant General's office in Lansing, and then to the Auditor General's office. And by this point in time, in the 1890s, the Auditor General has about 100 people on his staff now. They are the single largest entity within the Capitol building. What's interesting though about Belle, like many of the women who worked in the Capitol, she remained single throughout her life. Many of these women chose to or had to because they were supporting mothers and siblings and nieces and nephews. What's interesting though about Belle and these other single women is they live in boarding houses. Now, of course, that costs money, but it also brings certain advantages. If you live in a boarding house, you do not have to go home and cook your own dinner every night. Somebody else does that for you. If you live in a boarding house, you do not have to go home and scrub your own kitchen floor or clean the toilet. Someone else does that for you. I am with you. I am totally good with a return to boarding houses in America. And the thing is, this meant that these women had free time. They had evenings. They had Sundays. Eventually, they had 2-day weekends once those became a thing, which meant for someone like Belle, who had another interest, she could pursue it. By the early 1900s, she starts to get work as a published writer. Now, she initially writes short stories. They're very sweet, you know, everything ends happily ever after. The boy gets the girl, the orphan is adopted, you know, there's sunshine and roses everywhere. These stories start to get picked up by newspapers. And then they start to get picked up by newspaper syndicates, where they are being printed in states across America. And then, in 1911, she gets a contract for her first novel, which is called David Dunn. It's basically what we would consider today a juvenile. It's about a little orphan boy who is adopted and grows up to be governor of Michigan. Parts of the novel are actually set in the Capitol building, which means I find it completely charming because as they're walking through the building, they're talking about the Civil War battle flags. And they go in the chambers to watch session. There's a scene in the governor's office where they're talking about getting a pitcher of water up from a sideboard, and I'm reading this going, I know which sideboard that is in the building. Ultimately, she would write 7 novels. The most successful was called Amarillo of Clothesline Alley. It was a classic rags to riches story. It became so popular, it was optioned by Hollywood, and a silent film was made starring Mary Pickford, the first sweetheart of the American screen. In fact, Belle was so successful with her writing, she was able to quit her state job and spend the last decade of her life supporting herself as a full-time writer. In an era before retirement, before a social safety net, that was a remarkable thing to be able to do. And Belle was able to do it in part because of the structure that she had had at the Capitol as a working woman. Now, it's sometimes easy to think of these women as individuals, but we have to remember that a lot of them were running around the building at the same time. It is possible that the Coops washed the hand towels from the bathroom that Harriet used. And yes, we did have bathrooms for the women in the Capitol early on. It is also possible that that Belle Maniatas knew Marie Ferry. They both started working in the Capitol in the 1890s. Now, Marie is originally from upstate New York. She actually moves to Michigan as an adult with her husband. They come with another couple. They end up in Lansing, and they open a furniture and undertaking establishment. Because, of course, in the 19th century, those two things go together. We need wooden furniture, whether we're alive or dead. And the Ferry and Butts, that was the name of it, the Ferry and Butts Company of Lansing was happy to provide for your needs, above ground or under. But Marie's husband dies and leaves her little more than his stake in the business. And she decides she does not want to continue in this. So she sells out to the partner. The name remains for several years still. You can find their ads in the old Lansing papers. But she gets a job clerking in the Capitol. And she likewise starts to pick up extra work. So in addition to her 9-to-5 job, she starts to pick up some bookkeeping for the Michigan Pioneer Society. a statewide organization that is an ancestor of the Historical Society of Michigan. They are reborn in the 1870s as the Michigan Pioneer Society, and their first museum in the Capitol building is within Harriet Tenney's library. She was one of the founding members and was part of compiling the old Michigan Pioneer collections, if you're familiar with those volumes that the state produced from the 1870s into the late 19-teens. Marie eventually becomes so enthralled with the pioneers and develops the pioneers to the point where she turns this work into a full-time job. And in her 60s, at an age when we would all like to be retiring, she is named the first full-time curator of the Pioneer Society Museum. Now, as part of her work, she traveled around the state. There are stories of her taking trains from one end of Michigan to the other, arriving somewhere at 3 o'clock in the morning, taking a nap on the bench in the train station, and then getting up in the morning to go give a talk about Michigan history to school children, or to a church group, or to a women's club. She also, though, became the guardian of the state's treasures. When we think about the Capitol building, it was designed to be fireproof, in part to keep those records safe, but also to keep our dearest treasures safe. Things like our Civil War battle flags, things like artifacts from the first and second capitals. In fact, things from the third Capitol as well. And sometimes she can see the historical value where others cannot. On one side here on the left, you'll see an image of part of that old Pioneer Museum, which by this point in time had moved up to the 4th floor. On the other side, you'll see half a black and white stereo view of the governor's office. Now, the governor's office is a workspace. Today, if you see it, it's beautifully restored. But throughout much of its life, it was treated like an office, which meant every new governor got to potentially redecorate when they came in. So if Soapy Williams wanted green walls to match his bow tie, he got green walls. Well, about World War I era, the governor decided that he was going to get some new furniture for his suite. And there was talk that the original walnut parlor suite, made up in Saginaw by the Feges Company, was going to be moved out. Now, what does moved out mean? Well, that depends. Thankfully, Marie Ferry got wind of this and said, "You're going to do what?" "Well, okay, if you don't want your furniture, I would be happy to take care of it for you." So she pulls that parlor suite into the collection of the Michigan Historical Museum, where it is safeguarded for the next several decades. And about 70 years later, as we are restoring the Capitol and restoring the governor's office in the early 1990s, we were able to work with the museum to bring that furniture back. And I like to think that if such things are possible, Marie Ferry was smiling on us that day as we brought this beautiful parlor table and many other original pieces in the building in 1878 back into the governor's office again. It's a reminder, though, that sometimes we as historians do not see the full fruits of our labor. She took those pieces into her collection in the hope that they would be preserved. And I think that she would be very pleased to know that not only are they still being preserved today, 140 some years later, they are also back in their original home. There was a lovely circle that was closed when that move was made. Now, a lot of the women we've been talking about so far worked for the state as a career. Harriet ultimately spent 32 years in the library, 10 with her husband, 22 years on her own. Belle worked for the state for over 30 years. A lot of women, though, worked in the Capitol for a very brief period of time, because for many women, they were not looking for a career. They were looking for a way to earn a few dollars in between school and marriage, because for many women, they wanted to marry, and once they married, they wanted their own home. They wanted a family. They wanted to be homemakers. And many departments were happy to hire junior staff people who might only work for a year or two. That was fine. Now, there were still some, and this is by the 19-teens, who were a little wary of women working in the building. You see articles sometimes that pop up where people are saying, "Is it safe to have women in the building?" Well,
Yeah.
what this really means is it safe to have these young, attractive women mixing with these older, powerful men? And to be frank, there were some unpleasant situations that resulted, shall I say, ever so politely. There were many, though, who said, women need these opportunities and the state needs workers. It makes sense. And for a lot of the young women who worked in the building, they didn't just appear there out of the blue. Many of them got jobs because they had connections elsewhere in government. Think about it today. This is still how a lot of us find our jobs. We know someone who works somewhere, and they are able to tell us there's an opening, to say there's an interview, to put in a good word for you. Well, that was true of the McCabe sisters. The McCabe sisters, who grew up in the Paw area, had an uncle who worked as a senior clerk for the State Board of Health, or excuse me, the Insurance Commission, wrong one. Worked for the Insurance Commission in the 19-teens. They also had a friend who was elected to the legislature. And so about 1912, Annaldine McCabe is able to get a job clerking for the legislature. Now, legislative jobs are even more part-time because the legislature in this era meets every other year. Elections are held in even-numbered years like they are now. Sessions would start the January of the odd-numbered year, and they would go however long. Could be 4 months, could be 6 months, could be 7 months. It all depends on how much business there was to do. And what happens is when you are hired to work for the House or the Senate, you are expected to work until session ends, whenever that is. We can't tell you often until 3 or 4 days before it happens. And then you're done. Now, some of those people were able to transition to department jobs. Others just picked up and went home, and that was that. So this was very part-time work. Now, Annaldine, while clerking for the Senate, does exactly what she is not supposed to. She catches the eye of a senator. Now, happily for her, happily for both of them, I suppose I should say, he was unmarried. So this turns into a bit of a fairy tale romance, where the young, beautiful clerk falls in love with the young boy orator of the Senate, and suddenly everybody is watching them as they fall in love on the most public stage in downtown Lansing. In fact, when they got engaged, their engagement was printed in society columns across the state. And as Annaldine's sister Vivienne later told us, their parents were horrified that their little girl had gone to the Capitol and, as some people put it, had caught herself a husband. Now, I will take that with a grain of salt because I don't think they could have been too terrified, in that the second Annaldine had a diamond ring on her finger and was back in Paw Paw to get ready for her wedding, they packed up daughter number 2, that being Vivienne, and sent her to Lansing in her place. She moved in with Aunt and Uncle just as Annaldine had lived there. Uncle got her a job working in the tax division for the Auditor General's office, and she spent the next couple years in downtown Lansing. Now, I will say Uncle kept a close eye on her, and she was extremely glad of this one night. It was her duty at the end of the day, because we had already run out of space in the building, to take some of the big old leather-bound ledgers and take them up into the dome where they were storing records at night. Now, if you've ever been in the dome, it used to be more open than it is now, there is one way up there. And if that door is locked, you are out of luck, to put it oh so politely. Well, unfortunately, as she was taking records up, the door locked behind her, and she could not get out. Happily, perhaps because of what happened with her sister, her uncle always walked her home at the end of the day. So when she did not show up, he talked to someone in her office, reported what happened. They realized she probably got stuck upstairs, found the janitor with the keys, and they were able to retrieve her. Now, we know this story because when she was in her 90s, my predecessor, Carrie, was able to interview her and talk to her about her memories. She also talked about how one of her co-workers was a woman named Kitty Blair, who was the daughter-in-law of now deceased Governor Austin Blair, who, of course, we have a statue of right in front of the building. Kitty Blair had been very fond of her father-in-law, And as their office that they shared faced out on the front of the Capitol's grounds, apparently Kitty, when she was in a good mood, would come into work, and as she was taking off her wraps and uncovering her typewriter and getting ready for the day, would look out at the statue and say, "Good morning, Papa," to it. Vivian was also very careful to tell Carrie that she met her husband the proper way, meaning that she met him by attending socials at some of the churches that are just across the street in downtown Lansing. What she didn't tell Carrie is if she ever informed her parents that she appeared on the front page of the Lansing State Journal as the flower dancer in a local musical. We found this picture many years after she had passed. Now, in 1918, things change in Michigan when the men of Michigan vote to give women the right to vote. After fighting for suffrage since the 1970s, Michigan women now had full access to the ballot box. We got there just before we did nationally. And in 1919, that first odd election in April, and then in 1920, we start to elect women to statewide office. The first woman elected to the legislature is a woman who had actually been around the Capitol for a good 10 years before. Her name was Eva McCall Hamilton. Eva grew up right on the edge of Macomb and St. Clair counties. She was a farm girl who was interested in education, was able to go to a normal school, I think probably Central Michigan, although their records aren't great from this period, and she studied to be a physical education teacher. Somewhere along the way, she also met her husband, who would end up doing quite well for himself as an advertising executive for furniture companies in Grand Rapids. So they are able to move to Grand Rapids. They had a house in what we today think of as Heritage Hill in Grand Rapids. They did quite well for themselves. They were the epitome of upper middle class, white Protestant Anglo-Saxons. Her husband was very busy with work. They did not have a family. They had one child who died young. And so she becomes what I tend to think of as a professional volunteer. She gets involved in many local organizations, a lot of them focused on reform. So she is involved in an effort to bring the first farmers markets into Grand Rapids. Because at this time, there were local laws on the books that prohibited farmers from coming in and selling directly to consumers. They were supposed to sell to grocers who would then sell to consumers. And she said that drives up the price. We need to give people direct access to good, lower priced foods. So this helps bring about the Fulton Street Farmers Market that still exists today. She also becomes interested in seeing Michigan create a pension system for teachers. She wants to see Michigan create a system of mothers' pensions that was support for single mothers who were trying to keep their kids together and out of the poor farm, out of the state orphanage. She has a lot of radical ideas by some people's thinking, and she pursues them. She also, by 1912, is involved in the suffrage movement. And she is actually, it's very hard to see her here, but as a farm girl, she drove the horses on the suffrage float that we see in the Grand Rapids Parade here. Ultimately, in 1920, she is a very well-known figure who has been coming to the Capitol for years to lobby on these issues, testify before committees, speak with elected officials, and then suddenly she is the elected official. And there were a lot of eyes watching her, as you might imagine, when she came onto the Senate floor for the first time in January of 1921. It is said that when she walked onto the floor and up to her desk, which was on the center aisle right by the front, that her desk was covered in flowers that had been sent to congratulate her. And she received some good committee assignments. She was on the Banking and Finance Committee, which was considered a plum. She was, I believe, the chair for the Central Normal School Committee. But it takes her 3 months after she has written bills, after she has been voting on dozens of things, after she has been actively working in committees, it takes her 3 months into mid-March before she actually stands up on the floor to speak one day. And the moment she chooses doesn't have anything to do with one of her bills. She actually rose to speak on a bill that was written by one of her colleagues. This bill would have required anyone in Michigan applying for a marriage license to prove that they were in good health. Stop and think about what we're talking about for a minute. This is a complicated topic. This is a complicated topic in 2023. I always couch my language very carefully when I bring it up. Can you imagine being the only woman in the room in 1921 talking about that? But she got together every inch of courage she had, and she stood up and she said, I cannot be silent on this issue. She said, I know women personally who have fallen in love, who have married, and who have become ill to the point of death. She said some of them have unknowingly committed involuntary suicide because of this issue. And she said, I cannot sit here and be silent. I must speak on this. I'm sure you could have heard a pin drop in that chamber. The bill did not pass, but the newspapers, who all reported on this the next day, many of them noted that after she was done speaking, men on both sides of her stood up and came over to her desk to shake her hand and congratulate her on the fact that that day she spoke. And in some ways, she gave voice not only to her own thoughts and concerns, she was trying to give voice to half the state. It is very easy, I think, for us from a distance to glamorize first. The first woman, the first person of color, the first disabled person. These firsts that we often look for as historians. I think it is so easy, though, for us to forget how hard it is to be first. Harriet wrote about this as state librarian. She was very close friends with one of the Supreme Court justices. Her papers do not survive, but his do. And in his papers down at the Bentley, there is a letter she wrote him where she was asking for his support to be reappointed at one point in time. And she tells him bluntly, she says, there are many in this town that assume a woman who needs to earn a living will do whatever she has to earn a living. That again, that's a tough topic. We don't think of a librarian as being accused of selling herself. But that was how some of these women were looked at. If you need to support yourself, if you are willing to stand on a stage and be a public figure, there must be something a little wrong about you. You must have morals that are a little bit questionable. You're not the good, demure, quiet female that culture often applauded. Now, as difficult as it was for Eva, I think sometimes it's harder to be the second. The second woman to serve in the legislature was Cora Belle Reynolds Anderson, and she was as different as Eva as you can imagine. She also grew up on a farm, but she wasn't in southeast Michigan. She grew up on a farm in Lance, Baraga County, way up in copper country in the UP. She grew up with a father who was a teamster and a farmer, with a mother who was a homemaker, who was Métis, part French, part Native American. Now, Cora was a good student. She is the only one of her family to graduate from high school. In fact, when she graduated, the booming town of Lance produced 2 high school graduates that year. But she went beyond that. She attended a normal school in northern Michigan for a semester, and then because she was Native American, she sought out the opportunity to go to the Haskell Indian Institute, as it was then called. This was one of the boarding schools. This was brand new at the time. It had just opened. It was in Lawrence, Kansas. And in addition to educating children from across the country, they also offered normal courses. The idea being that Native students could come and they could train as teachers. so then they could go back home and teach in their own communities. It's a different piece of the boarding school narrative than what we often hear. But she enjoyed her time on campus. In fact, there are pictures of the campus. There's one in the lower left-hand corner from those early days when there were only a couple buildings that still survive, and her name is among their records. Now, she would return home to Lance. She fell in love with and married a farmer of Swedish descent, Charles Anderson. But before they had money to run their own farm, they worked as innkeepers when they were first married. And the inn that they kept, that white building there, the building still survives, though it is no longer a public inn. Now I'm talking about a public inn in Lance about 1905, 1906, somewhere in there. This was not the Holiday Inn or Best Western by any means. It was a rough place, and it was tiring, never-ending work. And it was work that Cora would remember in the years going forward. Fast forward to 1924 when she is elected, to 1925 when she comes to Lansing for her session. One of the bills that she authors has to do with public inns. She wanted to strengthen some of the sanitary measures on the books, because there were laws on the books at the time that talked about what kinds of linens you have to use. They wanted the linens to be things that were washable, so they would be washed frequently. They wanted to make sure the linens were long enough to actually cover the mattress on which you're laying. You know, the fact that these laws exist tell you something about how disgusting some of these places were. She saw this as a matter of public health, and she had been interested in public health for a long time. She was part of anti-tuberculosis efforts. She was also a temperance worker. So she authors this bill, one of several she will introduce. And one day, when it comes up for a vote on the floor, she stands up to speak on the bill. The only woman in a room full of 100 legislators. And then she sits down, and in the press the next day, it is noted, "It's so nice we have a woman in the House now to talk to us about proper bed making." There's another day when there is a lull between votes, and she stands up to thank the House clerk for some improvements that his staff had recently made to the chamber. Now this one is always very personal to me because I am part of the facilities staff. We take care of the building itself. She sits down, and the next day in the press it is noted, "A woman interrupted the busy work of the House to talk about housekeeping." There are other articles that describe how she wears her hair and her complexion, and how she dresses, where she is shopping in the big city of Lansing. Never mind, she went to Detroit frequently and could shop there if she wanted to. There is one person who interviews her when she first comes to town and tries to get her to divulge how she's going to vote for Speaker of the House. When she will not tell him, he writes, "She refutes the idea that women cannot keep secrets." And then he says, "More importantly though, the question is, will she try to influence the men around her in how they're going to vote?" And when you think about it, there's some truth to that idea, because throughout history, that is what women were told to do. We had to influence the men around us to speak on our behalf, because we could not speak. We did not have the ballot box. Now that we have it though, it would take a long time for that to change culturally. And you can often, I think, hear her gritting her teeth in these newspaper articles. I often wonder if at the end of a rough day, she peeled out of that chamber and went around the corner and into the state library as fast as she could, because that was a room full of women and she could find somebody to vent there. I will tell you though, I promise you, everybody in this room, a very nice steak dinner. She never lost her cool, not in public, because if she would have, it would have been in every newspaper from Monroe to Marquette. She understood that just as she had an uncommon opportunity to do things for others, so she risked taking the cause back. She risked, by putting her foot in it, she put her foot in the mouths of women across the state. It's a big responsibility to be a trailblazer. Now, one of those women in the library in this time was Mary Spencer. Mary Spencer had trained with Harriet, really was her professional protege, and she would herself work in the state library for 30 years. Mary, though, had a different idea of what the state library should be. Instead of thinking it should be a collection for state lawmakers, for state Supreme Court justices, for the people working in the Capitol building, she believed the state library should belong to everybody in the state. So in 1895, she is able to work with the legislature to pass laws that allow her to do different things with her collection. The first thing she starts to do is send out traveling libraries. Now, these were not sophisticated. These were oak boxes that both sides would hold about 50 books. And virtually anybody, a school teacher, a women's club, a historical society, a Grange group, could write to the library and could request a traveling library. You could ask for books of a specific topic or geared towards children of a specific age. And for the cost of shipping, Mary's crew would pack up that box and send it to you, and it was yours for the next 3 to 6 months. Or for communities that already had their own library, if they met certain stipulations, they could draw on the state's collection. So for example, the Peter White Library, way up in Marquette, was an associate, which means that if a high school student in Marquette had to write a paper on the move of the Capitol from Detroit to Lansing in 1847 and wanted to look at those journals from the House and the Senate, well, if Marquette didn't have them, a librarian there could write to Mrs. Spencer, and again, for the cost of shipping, Mrs. Spencer's staff would pack up the House and Senate journals and mail them up to Marquette, where those students could use them. In some ways, this is MEL, before we called it MEL. This is a system of statewide library exchanges. Within just a few years, there were over 700 traveling libraries on the road, and there were thousands of books going out on exchange. And in her spare time, Mary Spencer also helped up to 20 different communities in Michigan obtain Carnegie Library grants for their own facilities. And she is doing this all from the west wing of the Capitol building. Now, we also see women working in service-oriented jobs. Women are often hired as typewriters. That term, of course, as you probably know already as historians, meant not just the machine, but also the person operating the machine in the early 20th century. Women were often hired for this work because many of us had already spent hours learning how to move our fingers in different directions while looking at a piece of paper in front of us. Those piano lessons paid off, even if not in concert pianists. Women also, in the early 20th century, are hired to be switchboard operators. My grandmother worked for the telephone company for years. That's one way she was able to support those 6 kids growing up. Here we can see a photograph of some of the women at the switchboard from the 1930s. And by the 1930s, there is actually a publication that is geared specifically towards people working in the Capitol. This is kind of one of those little historical blips. It was called the Capitol Bulletin. It was one enterprising man's attempt to make his own way during the Great Depression. And from 1935 to 1942, he put together, he paid someone else to print it, a newspaper for state and federal workers. Because even state and federal workers, who are never going on their salaries, have a salary during the Great Depression. They still have a little bit of expendable income. So through ad revenue, he is able to put together this publication, which is a weekly. Now, I will tell you, this is one of my favorite things. Someday I'm actually going to get this digitized and put online so people can use it. Because the first page has legitimate Capitol news on it. This one, for example, on the front page has an article about the telephone service in the building and between different state venues. The rest of it is just pure gossip, and it is so much fun. You learn all about the sports leagues that we had. The governor had a basketball team, the attorney general had a basketball team, there was softball, there were bowling leagues, there were all kinds of card leagues, people playing whist and canasta and so on. You also hear about all of the good acts who are coming to town, where you can go dancing this weekend, where you might be able to win a bus ticket to go up north and see the fall colors. It's modest stuff, but it's the stuff of life. It's the stuff that our grandparents were doing. And I will tell you, it's really interesting to look at the ads specifically, because there are ads geared towards working women who work for government. These ads say things like, "We stay open late at this dress shop for women who work." And you can see how women are continuing to propel the Lansing economy forward, even during the bleakest time in American history. In the late 1930s, the third woman gets elected to the legislature. Neither Eva nor Cora were reelected, by the way. The third woman is Elizabeth Beelan. Now, some of us may know the Beelan name, in part because as she was serving in the House of Representatives, which was covered, by the way, not on the front page, but on the women's page in the newspaper, as she was serving in the House of Representatives, she often brought her 14-year-old daughter, Lucille, with her to events. And of course, Lucille would go on to follow her mother into government service and would serve on Lansing City Council for about 50 years. It's remarkable to think about what she learned by sitting at her mother's elbow, by going to session with her, working alongside her. And slowly, eventually, you start to see multiple women serving together. You start to see a majority of women in some departments. You start to see women in increasingly senior positions outside of the state library. And it's interesting to me how we can see through the historical record ties between them, ties that we don't always expect. I want to finish with a couple stories shown here on this slide. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read that letter to you because I know it's a little blurry. This letter is from the papers of Dora Stockman. Dora was elected to the House in 1938, and she would serve 4 terms in the legislature, the first woman to be re-elected successive times. But then again, she was already good at winning elections, because back in 1919, she was elected to the State Board of Agriculture. That makes her the first woman to hold statewide office in Michigan, literally elected in the first election in which women could run and vote for office. Her papers, naturally, ended up at MSU. That's what the State Board of Agriculture did. They administered the agricultural school. And as I was going through them a few years ago, I found this. It's written on Lady of Maccabee's letterhead. It reads, "My dear Mrs. Stockman, I note in the press that you are a candidate for public office, and I want to tell you how glad I am that you have consented to stand, because this is a position that a woman is well qualified to fill, and you above all others to fill it. You are a Republican, at least I think so, and I'm a Democrat, but nevertheless, you will get my ballot, and that of all the friends I can turn over to you. I shall be in Lansing on the 21st instant to attend the State Democratic Convention, and hope to have the pleasure then of meeting you. Very truly yours, Emma E. Bauer, great record keeper." You are a Republican and I'm a Democrat. Who cares? I still want to vote for you. You look like me. We share something in common. And you can see that commonality through time. In the 1940s, after Eva McCall Hamilton is dead, Elizabeth Beelan, a Democrat, fundraises, goes to women across the state of Michigan and raises money to have a portrait of Eva McCall Hamilton, a Republican, commissioned and hung in the Capitol. We can see that portrait hanging on the Senate chamber wall in this photo. And underneath it, posed for a picture in 1953, are the first 2 black women to serve in the legislature, Representative Charlene White and Senator Cora Brown. Now, they were also very different from Eva McCall Hamilton. They were a different party, they were a different race, they were both black women born in the segregated South. They had childhoods that Eva could not understand. But at the end of the day, when they looked at her picture hanging on the wall, they saw someone like them. They saw that commonality. And to me, That is the story that we need to be telling. And I will tell you, it still captures people to this day. I spent my first 10 years at the Capitol working as a tour guide and educator, which meant I was taking kids into the Senate chamber every day. And I will tell you, little girls, many of them, spent most of the tour going, does anybody look like me here? Anybody? Anybody? Lots of pictures of old guys on the wall. And then we'd get in the Senate and they'd see a picture of Eva and they'd go, oh, who's that? Tell me about her. That's the power of one story carried through time. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share some of those stories with you tonight. I will also say, if you have not been at the Capitol in a few years, come back and see us. We have portraits of 2 women on our walls now. The collection grows slowly. It's complicated. But I would love to host you sometime, even if you would like to come as a group, and show you some of these spaces, share some of the artwork with you, and maybe even take you in the old state library. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Valerie. Did you have a... Good. I think we already have given you a book in the past, Portland book, but we like you to have a pen.
Oh, I can always use more of those.
Well, this is kind of special to Portland, if I can get it open. This is made from the light poles
Oh,
of
that's so cool.
the ball field that we have, which is quite historic here.
Really?
So, yeah.
Oh, how
we love
fun.
that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I have a coworker who's into old baseball.
There you go.
He will think this is very cool.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Are there any questions?
Michael, talk about your mother.
Yeah, my mom was, well, my aunt Isla Swartz was the head operator, chief operator for the
Really?
switchboard
Oh, how
for
cool.
several years, and then my mother took her position and served as well. Yeah.
That's really
And his
neat.
mother was serving when they had the fire at the CAS building.
Oh,
And
sure, in
everything came through.
1951. Ooh,
Yep.
Gosh.
Her switchboard on the 5th floor ended up in the basement. Yeah.
So where did she end up then afterwards? Because I know the state workers were spread out all over
I
as
don't-
they tried to put things back together.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you which building
Okay.
they were
They
transferred
went to
to.
one of the, what do you call them?
Warehouse or?
No, they were,
One of the half floors in the Capitol?
no, it was like one of the buildings that were like left over from military or something.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'm trying to think what they call them.
Quonset?
The Quonset huts?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was like one of those, and so she and a good friend of mine, who's probably 90-something now, was one of the young operators that worked with.
Interesting.
His mother went there, that's why I know it.
I have a picture similar to the one you showed where they're at the switchboard. Yeah, it's very big.
I would love to see that sometime if you'd
Yeah.
be willing to share. That's very
Absolutely.
cool. Anyone else have Capitol relations? Any of you work for the state over the years or in the Capitol building? What'd you do?
I was in IT.
Okay.
I was the second class Ferris State College ever had for data processing. So I started out in the CAS building on the 3rd floor, I guess it was, and they had mainframe there. And
Okay.
it was a good career in the state.
Wow. Where did you end up? Did you always stay in the CAS building?
Yeah, well, no, I moved several places. In the Mason building for a while,
Okay.
and then down down on Pennsylvania Avenue
Okay.
with Department of Commerce,
Yep.
and finally with DNR.
Okay. So was DNR in Constitution Hall by that point?
Well, I was there and then across the street.
Okay.
Can't remember, what was that building? Yeah.
The Austin building?
No,
I thought you were the Mason, were you the Mason building? No.
the Mason building. Yeah.
Mason, yeah, Mason and Austin
Right.
and Hannah are all there right across. Yeah, my husband works in Constitution Hall and has lots of DNR folks in his building still.
Marjorie was 30 some.
34 and a half years with the state.
Okay, which department?
Mostly mental health, but
Okay.
30 years with mental health.
Okay, interesting. It's something, I'm very good friends, this won't surprise any of you, with the state documents librarian over at the state library. And we really enjoy being nerds together and looking through old department records and so on. And that's something, actually, I pulled together a program on a few months ago for current DHHS employees, is the early history of the Board of Health in the Capitol building. It's interesting because even during the 6 years of construction, so the building was constructed from 1872 to 1878, just in that period, the state creates 3 new boards or commissions that they need to find a place for. And it's fascinating to look at how some of them, like the State Board of Health, like the Board of Corrections and Charities, will ultimately evolve into their own departments. And we have, sometimes we have pictures of their offices, we have the old reports, we know the Board of Health even used to track weather conditions at the Capitol. So they had this special little stand built out on the west lawn that had all of this weather monitoring equipment because they were interested in how air quality and temperature and humidity and so on and barometric pressure affected health. And so they would publish this information in the Lansing State Journal every week. So if you're ever interested, if you're ever writing something about a particular event happening in the Lansing area and you want to know what the weather was, you can actually find it in the Lansing State Journal from those old Board of Health reports.
Well, thank you, Valerie, for
My
a
pleasure.
lovely